What I'm presenting here is something that came up into my mind when Mark was looking for someone studying attitudes, and then I realized, like, hey, I've got some attitudes to show. So it's really like a very much work in progress, which is normally perceived as very weird from some consumption studies, from the network studies, so hopefully you'll find it weird as well. And it's a very exploratory way of analyzing survey data. So what I'm trying to do is to describe a method that makes use of network analysis when you have survey data, and as me, you normally get lost in analyzing it. So the trial of the method, it's on the Tesco Shopper Thought Survey, which is a survey that Tesco, the big supermarket, runs with a panel of 60,000 consumers, where they measure any kind of thing. But they also collect data on socio-demographic and socioeconomic indicators. They normally ask attitudes about environment, shopping, food, and cooking. They ask many other things, but these are the variables I was interested in. And they also ask about reported behavior. So obviously here we are not observing what people do, but we're actually looking at what people say they do. And these reported behaviors relate to cooking methods, barbecue practices, eating practices, recycling, or food boycotting. So people saying, like, I won't buy a brand if I don't agree with the ethics and stuff like that. So the data are collected monthly. And I have data from July 2010 to April 2011, but consumers only answer the surveys once. So normally they are not asked to answer the same surveys more than once, and therefore I don't have panel data. It's actually an aggregate of all the questionnaires. But once you aggregate all these questionnaires, I actually have 26,366 questionnaires, which is the first time as a sociologist that I analyze this kind of data set. And I have 131 variables altogether describing these three different things. So when I first decided, okay, I have 131 variables, and obviously I had some hypotheses, so I did some regression models, I found some results, but I was getting frustrated because I have so many variables, and I was looking for a method that allows me to look at all these variables together. Now, obviously, when you go to a statistician and say, I want to look at all of them together, they start laughing because they say, like, well, if you correlate all of them, of course, you'll find something significant. But really, it's in order to explore what I'm looking for and to go beyond the hypothesis, I thought that maybe the network analysis would be useful. So first of all, I needed to find a way to make all these variables similar, because I had ordered variables, categorical variables, and all these kind of variables. So in my case, I decided to make everything categorical. So for example, I had a Richter scale of agreement, if we can call it a Richter scale. Yes, we can, actually. And so value 1 is now people who somehow or strongly agree. I recorded behaviors, so people saying, like, how often do you do, I don't know, barbecues, and like less than once a month, more than once a month. So I just recorded the weekly practices as 1, and all the others are 0. And then also you ask, like, how often do you buy, I don't know, organic products? And the regularly buyers are the ones who buys often and always. So now I have all categorical, which makes my life easier. But then I thought, like, okay, so I have 30,000 cases and 131 variables. And this in network terms is a two-mode network, because my cases, my rows and my columns are different, and therefore it's a two-mode. So if I correlate the variables, then I end up with a one-mode. So I have variables in rows and variables in columns. And the value in the cells is actually the simple value of correlation. Now, I did it in SPSS in the end as well, so I also have the Pearson correlation. But now I thought that, in the last few presentations, I realized that maybe I should use different kinds of correlation. But in this case, like when you use network software, it simply gives you the value of correlation without the significance. So now I have all the correlations. And in network terms, correlation is a way of block modeling the data. Because I have the structural equivalence, I'm not going to go into what is structural equivalence, but basically I have values from -1 to +1, and I can start grouping the variables together according to similar values of correlation. So in network terms, now I have that the nodes of a network are variables, and the ties are the correlation values. Then I have attributes for these variables. So I can see which variables are socio-demographic or socioeconomic variables, which ones relate to attitudes, and which one relates to behaviors. And if I don't run correlation, but I literally count the number of people who answer the questions, when I transpose my metrics now, it's getting confused, but you extract the diagonal value, and for each variable, I know how many people answer each variable. But I'm not going to use this information in this analysis, otherwise it gets too complicated. Then obviously, like, I thought, okay, now, the thing is that when you run correlation in SPSS, the maximum number of variables is 100. So I had 131 variables. I did try to use R, data, and stuff like that. I was wasting too much time. But then I realized that when you have a very low level of correlation, actually some of the variables don't correlate to anything, which means that also they don't correlate at a higher level. And luckily for me, there were 31 variables who didn't correlate that much, and normally they are the variables with a very low number of respondents, so I got rid of them. So I ended up with 100 variables, and I could run the correlation on SPSS, which is very lucky for me. And then you can visualize this network. So in the visualization that I'm going to show you, the red nodes are socio-demographic and socioeconomic variables. The blue nodes are attitudes, and the red nodes are the reported behaviors. The shape of the nodes will indicate which group these variables are in, and the ties indicates the value of correlation. So it could be from -1 to +1. And I'm going to show you only the positive correlations today. So once I have my network, then I need a method to analyze this network. So I can visualize different level of correlation, so correlation at a very high level, and I can start looking at components. A component in a network is a group of nodes that are linked together somehow. They might not be completely linked all together, but they are linked together and detached from other groups. So I can see which different clusters merge together when I lower down the level of correlation. Obviously, at a high level of correlation, I might have few groups. But then if I lower down, I start seeing this group merging. Then I can do faction analysis. Faction analysis is a similar kind of analysis, but instead of saying that the groups have to be disconnected, the program, the routine will place variables in different groups, even if there are some connections with these groups. And then I will talk about the EI index, which is simply giving an attributes of these variables. So one are socio-demographic, the other one are attitudes, the other one are behaviors. Which variables relate to other variables of the same type, which ones relate to variables of different types, and there is a way of measuring it. So, starting with a component analysis, this is the level of very high correlation, which is higher than 0.7. And what we can see here, that we have two behaviors. People who say that they regularly recycle, which is linked to people who say they turn off lights regularly. But then we have these attitudes coming in, linked to recycle, which is people say that they are concerned about what they can personally do for the environment. So it seems that we have two different sets of behaviors, which are sustainable behaviors, and they are related to a matter of individual responsibility. And then we have these two socio-demographic, which don't really tell us much. It just says that like older people are retired, which you would expect, hopefully. But then we lower down the level of correlation, and now we can see that there are more variables coming into play. So we have the pro-environmental component, the recycling and switching off lights, that adds more behavior. So buy with a minimal amount of packaging, trying to buy British, or don't choose a brand according to the ethics of the brand. trying to reduce consumption, so only buy what is needed, or researching products. So before I buy something, I research the product very well. So in a sense, it gives the idea that, and then it also links to a series of attitudes. So global warming is a serious concern. I feel pressure being green. But there is also something different, some different attitudes, which is like people who say that they do this sustainable behavior, they also want more things in supermarkets. So it seems that they have a kind of a special attention to consumption in general. But now we also have a new component, which is the one down here, which link together cooking methods and practices. So people who say they cook from scratch on a weekly basis, they also cook with leftover. And they are related to attitudes of liking experiment with food, willing to be energy and food self-sufficient, so growing your own vegetables, for example. But also, they say that, and then there is this other little component here, where people say that they would like to cook from scratch, but they don't have time, and they don't have time to prepare their food. So it seems as that cooking methods are limited by time. And that one over there, that's the barbecue addicted, people who tend to have barbecues on a weekly basis. So the barbecue addicted there. So we lower it down again. Now the component is getting bigger, the pro-environmental component, again, more attitudes come in. People enjoy shopping for groceries, shopping is an outing in itself, but also concerns about the environment. So in a sense, they say like, well, they think that sometimes the concerns about the environment are exaggerated, which gives strength to the idea that they're very attentive of about what they consume, but they also have a critical attitude, so they won't take for granted everything you say about the risk of the environment. And the cooking methods and practices components now get more complicated as well. So cooking from scratch is related to a more organized lifestyle, people saying that they always plan in advance what they want to cook. And again, the cooking methods which are limited by time. So people saying like, I like to cook from scratch, but I don't have time. I don't have skills, and I don't have time to prepare. And then you have the barbecue addicts on top over there. So you lower down again. Now you can really see this level of correlation higher than 0.4. You can really see these two groups, okay? Attitudes and behavior, the pro-environmental component doesn't add any more variables, but it increases the density, so they all become much more connected to each other. While the two components of cooking, so the one that says like, I'd like to cook from scratch, I don't have time, and the ones is like, I always cook from scratch, they now merge up, but only via eating prepared food or by attitudes. So if you look up there, the three nodes that are in between, they're all blue, and they say, and these are attitudes about, they agree that food is an important part of their life, they would like to be more self-sufficient in energy, and they like to cook from scratch. And therefore, we see that the attitudes mediate between different practices of cooking methods, and then you still have the elderly over there and the barbecue addict over here. We go down 11.3, and you see again the two groups. The barbecue addict now merge with the cooking methods, but they do it by cooking from scratch, cooking from frozen food, and cooking from frozen food relates to cooking from scratch and leftovers. So this is start giving us an indication of cooking practices. People freeze what they prepare and consider barbecue as a form of cooking from scratch. So when you buy a sausage and you stick it on a barbecue, that's cooking from scratch, which is better than opening a can anyway. And then like the click structure, the environmental component down here, that start becoming very clicky. So everything is connected with everything else. At 0.2, we finally get some socio-demographic and socioeconomic variables in. So the two main components, cooking methods and environmental attitudes, increase the density. But now we have all these socio-demographic and socioeconomic variables. So we start to see them. So we have A group of people in their 30s have lived in their houses for 5 or 10 years, they have 2 children. The next cohort have mortgages, work full-time, have lived in the current house for longer. People renting tend to move more, females tend to work part-time, people living with partners have 2 cars. Low-income people tend to live in, tend to have benefits for houses, they don't have cars, and they are divorced. And they normally, when they are divorced, they go back to live with parents, like people aged between 18 and 29. And then over there, up, again, we have the clique of elderlies, which are state pensioner, they own their houses, they don't have kids, well, they don't live with kids, and they have lived in their current house for a very long time. And this is a lower level of correlation, and now we can see that our different components merge together. So the 2 main components, the environmental attitudes and the cooking practices, join only via 2 variables, the regular use of composter and cooking with leftovers. So if you cook with leftovers, you normally have a compost. But now also the socio-demographic attitudes are, the variables are loosely connected to behaviors and attitudes. Now, obviously here, it gets more complicated. So we can start deleting some of the nodes. Well, no, first of all, because it gets too complicated, then we can go through faction analysis. So we can say, we can ask, okay, so if I have to divide these networks in different groups, how many groups will I find? So you try different groups, and the best fit is 4 groups. And here I have obviously like the cooking methods, the environmental bits. But now the socio-demographic and socioeconomic gets spread in 2. On one side I have old, low income, not working, but with high income and education as pendants. So there is a group of variables of old people and low income. And then we have the young middle-aged with kids on the other side. And just for the fun, if you only consider the socio-demographic and socioeconomic indications, then we really have these different groups of people. So we have the young people, the middle-aged people, the old people, but also females seems to, down here in green, they decline income, they work part-time, they're homemaker, for example. And we have the high-income people somewhere. I can't, but yes, the blue ones are the high-income people. They go to university, they work full-time, they own houses. And so you can start looking at your variables in this way. So finally, the EI index. So if I take the lower level of correlation, then what I want to see is like, okay, I have socio-demographic and socioeconomic, I have attitudes, and I have behaviors. What's the density? How many ties are there within these different groups? And you can see that, which is something that we were expecting, socio-demographic and economics don't really relate to each other. They're very loosely connected to each other. And they don't really relate that much with attitudes as well, a little bit higher with behaviors, but there are not many connections there. While attitudes with themselves seems to have more connections. So we have 0.17, it means 17% of the possible ties are there. And behaviors with themselves have 11% of possible ties, while behaviors to attitudes have 14.8% of possible ties. Now, when I apply this EI index, the EI index measures the ratio of tie groups, of tie that groups send externally to variable of a different group, and internally to variable belonging to the same group over the total number of ties that are there. So we can see that socio-demographic tend to have the same number of ties sent to other socio-demographic and socioeconomic variables that they send to different kind of variables. So it's very, very close to 0. 0 means that there is a balance, yeah? Attitudes and behavior, on the other hand, tend to relate more to variables of a different kind. So they have the number of external ties, which is much higher than the number of internal ties. So So what we can see is that attitudes and behavior seems to link more the variables altogether than socio-demographic and socioeconomic attitude. So, and then you can also extract some egoness. So you can concentrate on some specific variables that seems to be located in interesting positions. So for example, here I just took 2 of them out. So if you are a state pensioner and you tend to be retired, you are old, you're single, you own your house, but also you have another component up there which says that you tend to cook smaller portion than you used to, so you eat less. You cook from scratch, you plan to cook more, you like to experiment with food, you like to be self-sufficient in terms of energy, you think food is important. So the idea is that, you know, older people have more time to dedicate to food planning. While on the other hand, down here you have people working full-time, they don't really have time to do anything. So they tend to eat takeaway food, they have high income, they normally tend to be male and divorced, but then, you know, they said they would like to cook from scratch, they don't have time to prepare food in general. So you start seeing different kind of groups and different kind of attitudes and behaviors. Now what is interesting here is that none of them seems to have any pro-environmental attitudes. So very briefly the discussion, and this is a work in progress. I'm still not sure why I have to do this. I think it's fun and it gives me a lot of ideas, but I still haven't really found a good reason why you should use these and not using other methods. And I don't think you should use just these and not other methods. But basically what you can see is that social demographic and socioeconomic attitudes are very loosely related to attitudes and behaviors. Now, when I run all my regression model, actually what I saw is that attitude seems to explain much more reported behaviors than the socio-demographic and socioeconomic variables. The environmental component seems to be highly coherent. So basically what it's telling us is people declare to have pro-environmental attitudes, they know which behavior they should adopt, which doesn't mean that they will adopt it. So we're not obviously exploring the attitude-behavior gap. And cooking practices are constrained by time, which is something, again, that is in line with the literature. So people with time to dedicate to cook from scratch are more able to organize their life, and they can plan what to cook in advance. People with less time to eat prepared food and takeaway, both of them do not show any pro-environmental attitudes, although. So in a sense, it's just like a matter of practices and how they organize their daily life. So as a conclusion, because I think I'm running out of time, I think the method differs from other statistical methods, and I strongly advise if you want to use something like that, still use other methods anyway, because otherwise it doesn't really make any sense on its own. So I tried to do some factor analysis, which is good for data reduction. And more or less, you know, like because you use this correlation thing, it could be similar. But when you try to do factor analysis, you cannot really compute 130 variables per time. It's normally for hypothesis testing, so you need a small bunch of variables. Multiple correspondence analysis is very similar because that's exactly what obviously there are different algorithms behind. But in a sense, you know, it maps these variables in a space and you find the dimensions. So in a sense, it's very similar to what I'm doing here, but you don't really have any network measures. So you don't know about the density, you don't know about the EI index, you cannot calculate any centrality measure. Then I thought, well, maybe cluster analysis, but cluster analysis is normally used to cluster cases, not variables. And now I don't know any other, but you know, like we've seen today that a lot of statisticians are working on these kind of methods. Now, I think that the great thing about this is that you can really visualize a lot of variables at the same time. So you can use it as a preliminary exploratory analysis of survey data, and then you can combine it with other methods. So the idea is that when I run a regression, I normally have a hypothesis, which, thanks God, I have it. But then, you know, I normally test one dependent variable per time. And so basically I come with my theory, I have an hypothesis, I've got my data, and I test that hypothesis. Now, I'm a qualitative researcher, and I have a degree in literature. So once I've done it, then I get bored, and I need to do something more, and I want to explore a bit more, because otherwise I think like, okay, now then what? I mean, I have all this data. Is this the only thing I do? And this is when statisticians normally look at me as a devil. But basically, then this is just a very preliminary analysis. We can do a lot more analysis. So obviously, I can weight the variables according to the number of people who answer this question. So I can start seeing, okay, obviously there are variables correlated to each other. But, you know, what if my variable correlates to another variable and I only have 100 people answering it? So, you know, when you start weighting the variables, you can actually also see which are the variables which represents more my populations. And I can look at betweeners and group betweeners, so I can see what variables are in between different groups, different factions, but not only singular variables, I can also look at a group of variables that might be in between. Now, the group between us hasn't been implemented in network analysis yet, so we need to wait for the methodologies to do that.